The Young and the Restless spoilers Thurdays full episodes August 21st, 2025. Romance, regret, and the slow ache of change linger over Genoa City in the days to come, as longtime bonds are tested, losses are quietly mourned, and the smallest moments between characters reveal the deepest emotional truths. As the town moves forward, it does so not with loud declarations, but with whispered reflection, hidden sorrow, and the fragile hope that the next chapter, however uncertain, might still offer peace. At the Abbott estate, Diane Jenkins takes it upon herself to craft a night designed not only for love, but for stillness. The estate, often bustling with family matters and boardroom tension, falls into a lull as Diane transforms the evening into a private Italian reverie. Twinkling lights sway above the terrace, casting soft golden reflections against wine glasses half filled with Chianti. A playlist of Italian classics hums in the background, interrupted only by the rustle of leaves and the occasional breath of shared memory. Jack Abbott, ever the skeptic when it comes to orchestrated perfection, finds himself slowly disarmed. This isn't a grand gesture meant for anyone but them, it's not about appearances or proving anything to the outside world. It's a stolen moment, a chapter quietly tucked away between chaos and obligation. They speak briefly of family, their voices laced with fondness as they anticipate the return of their grandson. Jack, always chasing time between his roles as patriarch and CEO, gently suggests that they savor these rare, uninterrupted nights. The conversation that follows is tender but admittedly predictable. Two people who have weathered so many storms now rest in the eye of one, trying to remember what calm feels like. For all its simplicity, the night does what it's meant to do. It reminds them of who they are without the noise. Elsewhere, beneath a sky freckled with stars and atop the silent beauty of the Genoa City Observatory, a very different kind of conversation unfolds. Claire Newman and Tessa Porter, two women bound by recent grief and emotional turbulence, find themselves sharing more than just gelato. The night air is gentle, but there's weight in it, an invisible heaviness that only those nursing fresh wounds can sense. Tessa, with her usual warmth dimmed by loss, listens as Claire awkwardly but earnestly expresses condolences about Cole Howard. It's clear the pain is still raw for Claire, who's not yet learned how to grieve publicly. She stiffens at the mention, her grip on the tiny spoon tightening slightly. Yet Tessa, intuitive and grounded, doesn't press, she simply meets pain with her own. The conversation turns quietly, as these things do, from sympathy to self-revelation. Claire, ever perceptive, inquires about Mariah Copeland. There's a flicker in Tessa's eyes. Sadness, resignation, perhaps even shame, as she responds with a sentence she hasn't yet gotten used to saying aloud. Mariah and I are separated. The words hang there for a moment, as if waiting for the stars themselves to register them. Claire is visibly shocked. Like many, she had seen Tessa and Mariah as a rare constant in a town of shifting allegiances and fleeting love. They were, for so long, the couple others pointed to as proof that love, real love, could endure. But sometimes endurance masks distance. I thought you two were perfect, Claire says quietly, her voice cracking not with judgment but with genuine sadness. I did too, Tessa replies, a quiet breath following the admission like a door slowly closing behind her. For a moment, the two women are suspended in a shared understanding, the grief of what's been lost, and the loneliness that follows when you're left to sort through the pieces. Claire, who has spent too many recent nights staring into a dark ceiling and asking unanswerable questions, admits that she hates navigating this kind of pain alone. But Tessa, wiser than she appears in the flicker of starlight, gently assures her she isn't. She speaks softly of a conversation she had recently, of someone who offered her clarity and comfort. She doesn't name him, but her tone is warm and grateful. It's not romantic, it's deeper than that. It's the kind of connection built not on attraction but on understanding. Someone listened. Someone saw her, really saw her, and didn't look away. And in a world where grief often isolates, that glimpse of companionship feels sacred. The night doesn't end with big reveals or dramatic shifts. There are no declarations or confrontations. But something fundamental has changed. Diane and Jack, however repetitive their words, are leaning into the simplicity of togetherness with more patience than before. Tessa and Claire, meanwhile, carry each other through the quiet kind of pain, the kind that doesn't scream but lingers. Each storyline, whether romantic or sorrowful, is rooted in a deeper truth. Healing doesn't come in grand gestures, but in steady breaths, honest words, and the bravery to let someone else see you at your most vulnerable. As Genoa City spins on, its people inch forward, through breakups and reconciliations, through silence and solace, through stars and shadows. And for now, that's enough. Society was louder than usual for a weeknight. A metallic hum of cutlery and low conversation stretched across the marble and velvet like a nervous system, and Daniel slipped through it with the wary gait of a man who'd learned to treat public places like puzzle boxes. He wasn't there to eat. He wasn't even there to be seen. He was there because a thread he'd been tugging on all afternoon led straight to this room, this table by the back wall, and the man currently angled toward the city-facing windows with a phone at his ear and a posture that said he wanted the world to believe he was at ease. Holden Novak didn't lower his voice, but he didn't raise it either. He spoke in that measured register of people who assume discretion will be mistaken for civility. Daniel caught just enough to understand the architecture, Kane's name, a schedule, a signal that sounded less like a signal and more like a courtesy to someone who didn't need courtesy. And the phrase "the billionaire" dropped into the sentence the way people drop a brand name when they want it to do the work of a footnote. Daniel had questions, society had acoustics for questions, and he had never been particularly good at pretending coincidence when the room was doing him the favor of context. He stepped out of the column of shadows and into Holden's eye line with a neutrality he didn't feel, a half-smile that could pass for friendly if you weren't trained to hear the grind behind it. "Funny thing," he said, not bothering with preamble, "you, Kane, and the billionaire. Small town for very big people." Holden ended the call with a quiet goodbye, not rattled but not quite relaxed, and took a beat before inviting Daniel to sit as if the chair had been waiting for him the whole time. The pleasantries lasted as long as it took Daniel to slide them off the table. He went straight for the cut. He and Kane shared more than headlines, he said, an ex-wife, tossed into the conversation like a match, and perhaps that common ground gave him the right to ask whether Holden's mother was making a mistake by aligning with Kane at a moment when half the town was either weaponizing the man or writing his eulogy. It wasn't an accusation. It was a hypothesis offered in a tone that hinted at evidence. Holden didn't blink. He asked what Daniel wanted in the simple language of distrust, leverage or clarity. Daniel answered with the only truth he could stand behind in a town that eats nuance for breakfast. He wanted his mother to be safe from the blowback of other people's courage. "If you don't want to talk about Kane's plan, don't," he added, a small concession that sounded like restraint and functioned like bait. "I'll find it somewhere else. But I'm not going to be the son who watched the car skid and pretended the road was dry." Holden let the words settle, then pivoted with an ease that told Daniel this wasn't his first interrogation dressed as a drink. He spoke of the future instead of the plan, of a notion that had been clinging to the inside of his ribs since the last funeral. A nightclub, not as an escape hatch but as an ordinance against grief, a place where the city could go when its bones ached and still remember what rhythm was. It sounded like a dream and a blueprint in equal measure, and for a moment Daniel saw the version of Holden who existed far away from boardrooms and bravado, the man who wanted to build a room where music could do what apologies no longer could. The conversation might have bent toward détente if the night hadn't folded in on itself at that exact moment with two familiar voices at their shoulder. Claire Newman and Tessa Porter arrived with the kind of unassuming presence that changes the temperature of a table without announcing itself. They were not supposed to be there. They were exactly where they needed to be. The questions were simple: how are you both, what's the news, and the answers, as always in Genoa City, were more complicated than the grammar could comfortably carry. "I don't know about my new friend," Holden said, letting humor lift the sentence while his eyes stayed on Claire long enough to show where the gravity really was, "but I do know my night just got better." He flagged the bartender and asked if anyone minded a round of Vespers, as if offering a drink could build a temporary bridge over the small landslides underneath their shoes. Glasses arrived, clear and cold and faintly floral, and for a minute they played at being people who could toast without thinking of who wasn't there to clink the rim. It didn't last, because it wasn't supposed to. Claire's loss hung in the air the way loss always does, quiet and instructional, and the conversation found it the natural way water finds downward. Holden didn't ask for details, he didn't have to. Claire's face softened but didn't collapse, and she gave up a small truth with the economy of someone who didn't want to spend the whole night paying for it. It's still raw, some days are steadier than others, and the shape of the missing changes hourly, which is worse because it keeps you guessing even after you've accepted that guessing is all that's left. Daniel nodded, the reflex of a man who had buried a version of himself when he buried someone else. He didn't sharpen the scene with names, but he didn't hide either. He'd lost his partner this year, and it had made the world disobedient. Heather had at least been honored with a goodbye the town could witness, a funeral on screen, a procession of words, that was something, if only because not everyone gets even that. He said it with gratitude and a grimace, aware of how macabre it sounds to call yourself lucky for having a ceremony to stand in. Holden, who claims to prefer silence when it comes to grief, surprised them by stepping into the center of it with his own admission, stripped of theatrics. There isn't anything harder, he said, than losing the person your days were built around. It breaks the windows you didn't even know were windows. He made the confession like a man who'd been practicing saying it all day and still didn't like the way it felt in his mouth. Tessa, who had been holding herself together with a series of small muscles no one else could see, finally let the sadness show at the edges. It wasn't messy, it was honest. Holden noticed and asked the question gently, had she lost someone too, leaving enough room for the answer to be complicated. No one died, she said, which sounded almost like an apology. But my soulmate and I, she didn't finish the sentence, and she didn't need to. The ending was there between the words, a quiet break threading its way through years of music and shared mornings. Holden didn't try to recategorize it. He just named it accurately, grief, and said it aloud with the respect people reserve for churches and hospital rooms. It's good to have someone to be sad with, he added, and though the line could have wilted in lesser company, here it landed like a warmth you notice out of season. They drank to nothing and to everything, and the conversation widened just enough to hold all four of them without snapping. All of us, then, Holden said, lifting his glass a fraction, carrying it. He let the admission breathe and then, as if he owed the table the fullest version of the truth tonight, told them he had buried his best friend that morning. The name, Damien, put a shape to the absence, and Claire's face changed as memory rewired the geography. She'd forgotten, she said, how close he and Damien Kane had been, and the forgetting felt like a small betrayal in a week that already had too many of those. Daniel and Tessa didn't manufacture comfort, they offered presence, which is the only commodity that doesn't depreciate at wakes and dinner tables pretending not to be wakes. This is a hard season, Tessa said, finding a tone that didn't tremble, but it's easier when the room understands. She looked at Daniel when she said it, a smile that didn't condescend passing across her face, and he understood the invitation there, to stand still for a minute, to let the room hold him too. What passed between the four of them in that pocket of society wasn't a treaty or a plot, it was a recalibration. Daniel abandoned, for 1 hour, the trap of looking for answers in other people's phone calls and remembered to ask for them in faces instead. He saw that Holden's caution wasn't a smokescreen so much as a manifestation of a new rule. After a burial, you move slower because the world has proven its speed isn't your friend. He saw, too, that Claire's steadiness was less about denial and more about rationing. Grief is a long-distance run that punishes sprinters. And he saw that Tessa's gentleness, even as her own life broke along a seam she had spent years reinforcing, wasn't fragility. It was strength refusing to costume itself as armor just to make other people comfortable. Eventually, the talk circled back to the work everyone had been trying not to discuss, the billionaire's shadow, Kane's orbit, the mothers and fathers who still insist on calling interference love. Daniel didn't repeat his original question about Holden's mother. He had already asked it and heard the answer he needed in everything Holden hadn't said. Instead, he offered something less precise and more binding, a warning without threat, that the alliances forming in this city had begun to break people faster than the people could replace themselves, and that if Holden was going to build anything, a nightclub, a life, a map, he should choose the materials with the kind of care that remembers how easily chandeliers become shrapnel when the ceiling gives way. Holden accepted the admonition not as insult but as kinship. Men who have carried caskets don't waste energy pretending they can't hear the creak in a floorboard. When they finally pushed back from the table, the vespers half finished and the night a little softer, nothing in the town's machinery had changed. The billionaire remained unnamed but inevitable. Kane remained both problem and person. The mothers would continue to frighten their sons with the consequences of disobedience, and the sons would continue to pretend they didn't already know the price. But a small geometry had shifted. Daniel no longer needed to eavesdrop to learn Holden's center of gravity. Holden no longer needed to test Daniel to believe that his caution came from love, not leverage. Claire and Tessa left with the tiniest of smiles, which in this season counted as a victory one notch below a miracle, and the door that closed behind them didn't feel like an ending so much as a hinge at last oiled after months of squeal. On the sidewalk, the city air smelled faintly of rain and citrus. Daniel watched Holden tip his face toward the sky the way people do when they are inventorying the weather inside and out. "It gets better," Daniel said, and made no promise about the timetable. "Or we get better at it," Holden countered, not asking which answer was kinder. They didn't shake hands. They didn't seal anything. They simply stood there a second longer than strangers do and then went their separate ways, carrying glasses they couldn't put down and the slight, miraculous relief of having carried them together for an hour. Inside, the staff cleared the table as if clearing a stage between acts, and society returned to being what it always is. A place where Genoa City comes to talk about business and accidentally tells the truth about itself instead. The old Railcar bar at the edge of downtown, Kane's tongue-in-cheek choo-choo line to nowhere, hummed like a held breath. Brass lamps cast warm rings over the teak counters, the faint rattle of glassware echoing each time a server crossed the aisle where seats had once faced a countryside that never really belonged to Genoa City. Tonight the car wasn't moving, but everything inside Kane Ashby was guilt, adrenaline, the grinding ache of a father who had watched a headline outrun his explanations. He stood alone at the far end, jacket off, sleeves shoved to his elbows as if hard work could be performed on grief and produce something useful. The door hissed on its tracks and Phyllis Summers breezed in with a smile designed for rooms that needed rescuing and a bottle of champagne she lifted like a wand. He didn't look up for long. One glance told him what the night would try to become, and he refused it. This was not a night for bubbles and victory poses. "Not now," he said, the words flat enough to make the chandelier stop pretending to sparkle. Phyllis's smile thinned, then sharpened. Her armor has always been charm refurbished into defiance. "Then hear this, I'm about to go on a tear," she teased, letting the cork's promise hang in the charged air. Kane gestured toward the floor drain behind the bar and told her to pour it out if she needed a ceremony that badly. He wasn't raising a glass to anything. Celebration would feel like vandalism next to what he'd done to his children by letting the town discover him before they heard him. The confession scraped out of him in one piece. He'd broken their hearts, not in the abstract, not soap opera capital T trauma, but the real kind where a kid reads a sentence on a phone and the room they live in becomes a set. Phyllis stopped posturing and did something braver than banter. She pivoted away from him and lifted an empty flute toward the air, toasting the children, his and hers and every other kid this city had ever drafted into adult wars. "They are stubborn, brilliant mirrors," she said, her voice going low with something like reverence, "and they make us earn our way back." She confessed what everyone still uses as a punchline until they remember it drew blood, that she faked her death, that apologies are heavier when you deliver them to the faces you hurt, that the road back to your own kids is paved with humiliations you choose because you should have chosen better sooner. The railcar creaked, with answering weather, and the sound of it made space for honesty. They had been circling a wary friendship in recent weeks, the kind that emerges when two complicated people stop pretending their complications cancel each other out. That closeness is an accelerant. It burns through small talk and leaves only the stuff no one wants to touch. Phyllis set the bottle down, no cork loosed, and admitted she'd been sitting on something she should have said the minute it happened. She tried to soften it with a preamble. He cut the patting with a look. So she told him straight, she'd seen Lily Winters at society, tight-shouldered and overbright, repeating for anyone who might carry it that the kids had found out that Dumas had stopped being rumor and become an identity glued to their father in public. That was why Phyllis had come to the Railcar, because pity and warning sometimes share a doorway and she knows which threshold she's built to stand in. She said she was there to bolster him, not to pity him, to be a witness who didn't flinch. After all, she added, with an optimism that sounded like both invitation and dare, they were partners now. It was the kind of word that tries to set a table for two in a room designed for one. Her eyes flicked to the bottle, to his fingertips, to the way he kept tapping the bar's edge like he was checking a pulse. She wondered aloud if she'd overstayed, if perhaps the smartest move would be to leave him alone with his ghosts so he could make a plan without her fingerprints on it. He told her not to go. The refusal came out gentler than the man giving it felt. Staying didn't fix anything, but leaving would turn the car back into a coffin. So they stayed, not to drink but to inventory. She told him what the town would do next, how people who never earned a moral kept one in their pocket ready to spend, how phones would hum with triumphant half-truths, how even the ones who loved him would begin to draft protective narratives for themselves that required him to be the villain in the prologue. He told her what the kids had said and, more bravely, what they hadn't, the devastations you infer from silence. The way one of them wouldn't meet his eyes because he had learned early that you don't give your gaze away to someone who might sell it, the way another performed forgiveness so quickly he knew it was being staged for her own survival, not offered as a gift to him. They talked about Lily without turning her into a caricature, because, God help them, love and anger are two furniture pieces that keep showing up in the same room when you co-parent after the truth has gone public. Phyllis didn't try to recast Lily as an antagonist, she simply described what she'd seen at society, the way fear makes even the best of us grab the loudest tool in reach. She talked about her own children, how proximity to her chaos had given them a vocabulary they should never have needed, and how every time she thought she'd paid her debt she found a new ledger with charges she had missed. He let himself imagine, out loud, telling his kids the unvarnished whole of it, not to be exonerated but to be legible, and then admitted he didn't know if he had earned the right to speak that long without first surviving their cross-examination. Somewhere in the exchange, the temperature shifted from damage report to design. If people were going to weaponize Dumas as a brand rather than a mistake, he would have to decide whether to dull the blade or catch it and bend it. Phyllis sketched options the way only a survivor of every possible storyline can. Control the narrative by over-confessing to someone who would put it on camera in a way that couldn't be cut for malice. Preempt the worst angles by naming them first and refusing to blink, or retreat from the stage entirely and let time calcify rumor into background noise until the town's attention span did what it always does, wander. Every path cost, and he could price each one in a currency he now understood too well. His children's patience. He wanted a move that protected them without turning them into exhibits. He wanted to save something private from a fire that had already eaten the curtains. Phyllis, for once, didn't push for spectacle. She remembered what it felt like to watch your kid listen to your apology like they were in a courtroom and you were a man with a sentence to sell. She asked what he needed tonight, not tomorrow. He surprised both of them by saying he needed someone in the room who wouldn't congratulate him for breathing and wouldn't punish him for bleeding. Present is both the simplest and the rarest ask in this town. She reached for the cork again, then thought better of it, and put her hand on the bottle as if it were a volatile instrument that needed a steady weight to keep from rolling. And because honesty loves momentum, the banter tried one last time to become seduction. Of power, of alliance, of the old theatrical promise that two complicated people can become invincible if they call themselves a team. He told her they were alike in more ways than was comfortable, both stubbornly resourceful, both better at recovery than prevention, both addicted to the hope that the next move might be the one that turns a life back into a story worth defending. She grinned at the mirror and called it chemistry, then translated chemistry into contract. We're a great team. Her eyes dared him to disagree. He didn't flinch or soften, He removed the dare from the table like a live wire and spoke with the calm that arrives when you've finally decided to be specific. He admired her, said it without decoration, and she believed him, but he wouldn't lie about the terms. They were not partners. She was not the queen to his king, because he did not intend to sit a throne at all. Kingship is just another costume in a city where costumes get you killed. He wasn't looking for an equal in a kingdom, he was looking for a steward of damage who could tell him when to stop before the next bruise called itself strategy. He respected her counsel, wanted her steal in certain rooms, valued the way she can smell a trap at 100 paces because she once set them for a living, but he would not rename the arrangement just to make the night feel safer. Her chin lifted, hurt and pride touching elbows, then settled. If she was disappointed, she hid it with a sophistication she didn't always bother to deploy. What he gave her was more sustainable than flattery, a job description, not a fantasy. Silence took a turn around the car and came back carrying a kind of peace. She twisted the champagne just enough to hear the cage sigh and then stopped. They didn't need the pop to measure progress. She told him she would stay for one drink of something honest, black coffee, no sugar. And then she would leave the railcar to him so he could rehearse the sentences he would use with his kids until the language didn't sound like a stranger in his mouth. He made the coffee, and while it dripped she stood at the window where the view is just city lights pretending to be stars and said that if Lily was telling the world their children learned from a feed before they learned from family, then Lily was grieving too, in her way, loud and weaponized, and that grief makes arsonists of people who would otherwise be architects. He didn't defend Lily and he didn't indict her, he simply nodded like a man who has finally understood that explanation is not exoneration. She took her coffee to go, planted one palm briefly against his forearm the way people do when they have earned an inch of intimacy without demanding a mile, and started down the aisle. He called her name, not to walk back the boundary but to underline it with gratitude. "You came to cheerlead," he said, a ghost of a smile crossing his face, and stayed to calibrate. "That matters." At the door she looked back at the champagne and at him, at the night that had refused spectacle and become something better, durable. "When you're ready," she said, "we'll open that on your kids' terms. Or we'll never open it at all." He didn't promise a future he couldn't guarantee. He promised a next step he could survive. Tomorrow, the truth without choreography, told to the only audience that matters, even if it buys him silence instead of applause. She left, taking the performance with her, and the rail car settled into its quiet. Kane rinsed 2 flutes and shelved them side by side, not as a metaphor but as a task that didn't ask him to choose a myth. He had called the night what it was, a hard refusal of easy partnership, and in that refusal he had kept the one thing he could still give his children for free. A father who won't outsource responsibility to a duet, no matter how tempting the harmony sounds when the town gets loud. Society always felt like a pressure valve disguised as a restaurant, a place where Genoa City's arguments were plated as entrees and the aftertaste was strategy. Tonight its glass and brass glow made a kind of sense to Claire Newman because the moment she said out loud that everything had grown worse since Kyle Abbott came back from Nice, the tempo faster, the silence is sharper, the eyes on her a little too practiced. Tessa Porter didn't try to fix it with optimism, she simply touched Claire's elbow and steered her to the only room in town where the noise could drown out the worry long enough for words to line up. Claire hadn't meant it as accusation, she meant pattern recognition. Kyle's return had stirred sleeping pieces on too many boards, old alliances waking with new appetites, and every hallway now felt like a corridor built for ambush. Tessa listened the way singers breathe before a hard note, letting the pauses stay honest, promising only this, a booth, a drink, and time enough to say everything without the room deciding what it meant before she did. They crossed the threshold into society and the place answered with its usual theater, cutlery hum, a piano line stitched under conversation, the bar backlit like a confession booth, where at the far end Holden Novak stood with a phone to his ear, voice low and businesslike, the kind of tone men use when risk is an old friend. Daniel Romalotti Jr. had arrived seconds before and taken up residence in the shadow between 2 pillars, and if he wasn't trying to listen then society's acoustics were conspiring against him. He caught the name Kane with the clarity of a bell, along with the cadence of logistics that never say what they mean, windows, lists, a person who mustn't be surprised. Enough connective tissue for a man whose mother had recently practiced the art of alliance to feel the prickle of responsibility at the base of his neck. Holden ended the call, dropped the phone face down on the bar like a gambler folding a hand he still liked, and Daniel stepped forward without a costume of coincidence, introducing himself with the economy of a man who knew exactly why he was interrupting. He had a mother to protect from consequences she could survive but didn't deserve, and her latest orbit around Kane made his teeth ache. There was no threat in his posture, only math. He and Kane had a tangle of history that wasn't theoretical. They had both worn rings with Lily Winter's name humming under the gold, and that gave him standing to ask whether Phyllis throwing her lot in with Kane was cautionary wisdom or rehearsed disaster. Holden let the question sit a beat too long, keeping his expression friendly while his eyes cross-checked motives, and then he did what people do in a town that taught them how easily curiosity can be weaponized. He asked whether Daniel was digging for Kane, whether this sudden civic concern came on a leash. Daniel met the suspicion with a small shake of the head and a sentence that carried just enough frustration to sound true. He didn't lift a finger for Kane. He wasn't here as anybody's scout. He was here to keep his mother from becoming a footnote in a plan that served men who never read the notes they write for their own families. The air between them detensed a notch. Holden's mouth moved toward a smile, not because he'd been charmed but because the shape of Daniel's intent finally made sense, protective, not predatory. And once that was clear, something else surfaced, something that had been clinging to Holden since the graveside service that morning. A desire to build a room that answered the weather life had become a nightclub, not as an escape but as a deliberate alternative to watching sorrow do laps in their living rooms. He said it shyly for a man who could sell spectacle, lights and sound and a door policy that prioritized breath over bravado, somewhere music could anneal the day's fractures, where people who had buried something could stand in a dark that didn't feel like loss. Daniel surprised himself by liking the picture. They might have stayed there, two men suspending politics long enough to imagine a sound system, if Tessa and Claire hadn't arrived at their shoulders with the soft gust of night air society's revolving door always brings, their presence changing the temperature like a key change. Holden, delighted to be rescued from the edge of confession, flagged the bartender and asked for a round of Vespers, society's gin and vermouth benediction that tasted like clean decisions. And declared, with a quick glance that landed on Claire and stopped there, that whatever this night had been trying to be, it had just improved. The four of them took a high top by the rail. Daniel seated the talk-to-win posture he'd walked in with and chose instead the luxury of candor, telling Holden that his mother's choice to ally with Kane wasn't a referendum on Holden or anyone else. It was Phyllis being Phyllis, reckless and brilliant in the same breath, and that his question wasn't how do I stop her, so much as how do I get ahead of the blast radius if this goes sideways the way it so often does. Holden answered without the theatrical suspicion he'd begun with, admitting that men with phones and plans rarely asked who had to carry the plan's weight once the ink dried, and that the only thing he'd promised today was to stop pretending momentum is the same as wisdom. Claire let the talk run its course before easing her own trouble onto the table. The way you set down a heavy bag instead of dropping it. She told Tessa she hadn't meant to indict Kyle with that remark about things getting worse since he'd returned from Nice, only to acknowledge that returning has gravity. It pulls stories into old grooves, stirs sleeping loyalties, wakes debts, and that lately every room felt like it wanted a version of her she had already outgrown. Tessa, who knows the difference between comfort and companionship, slid a glass toward Claire and said that growth and danger often arrive in the same suit, that the heart can't tell the difference at first, and that if Kyle was making the air thinner it might be because everyone else was breathing him instead of oxygen. Holden, hearing the name without the history, promised nothing he couldn't keep, a table where her name wasn't currency, a dance floor where her shadow could be hers again. Daniel, softer now that the confrontation had been metabolized into conversation, raised his glass to what they were really doing at that rail, telling the truth before the city got a chance to tell it for them. The Vespers arrived and made small halos in the low light, and for several minutes they practiced the rarest skill in Genoa City, staying on one subject long enough to hear it, letting Daniel sketch the odd fraternity of men who had loved Lily and then learned how to live after, letting Holden map the edges of his nightclub idea until it sounded less like a fantasy and more like zoning law and a list of permits. Letting Claire say out loud the sentence she had been carrying like a hot coin, that she didn't want to be afraid of rooms that only existed because someone else decided how she should fit inside them. Letting Tessa fold the moment shut around them with the quiet competence of a person who has learned how to host grief without letting it redecorate the house. When the bartender drifted by, Holden asked for a second round and called them Vespers again with a smile that made the name feel like both cocktail and evening prayer, and he said, not to win points but to mark a fact, that it was good to have people to be sad with and still talk about tomorrow, good to have a blueprint on a napkin and a friend who isn't offended that you're afraid. By the time the glasses were half gone, whatever edges Daniel had brought into the room had rounded. Holden no longer looked like a man guarding a door. Claire's shoulders had stopped bracing for impact, and Tessa, who had engineered the entire migration from panic to presence with a few well-timed choices, finally let herself smile, small and sincere and new. Society noise rose and fell around them, the city's private soundtrack doing what it does best, covering strategic retreats and small salvations, and for 1 hour a quartet that should have been an argument became something quietly radical. For people telling the truth, in public, without a fight.